Well, welcome. We are back with another episode of the When Love Leads podcast. Rick, introduce Davin to us, if you would.
What a great story he's got. I'm really excited about the association that he's leading today and look forward to having to hear more about it. But before we get started on that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you born, raised, and a little bit about your family?
Well, Rick, Bill, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to be on When Love Leads. I'm originally from Philly. I grew up in a 100% Italian family home, spent the first 18 years of my life in Philly, moved my senior year of high school to Michigan, where I then met my bride of now 18 years, and we've got two lovely children, 14 and 11. Lived in Michigan for 25 years and recently moved down here
Wow.
to Charlotte and have just been in Charlotte for over a year, Rick, where you and I met. And it's been a great journey so far.
Well, you certainly have to endure the winters in Michigan, but you got to endure the summers in Charlotte. So hope that's going well for you and your family. Would you tell us a little bit about your faith journey, Davin?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in a 100% Italian home on the East Coast. So, naturally, as most would assume, I was Catholic. I was raised in a very devout Catholic family. I knew of God. I even would say that I had somewhat of a relationship with him, but not a relationship with Christ directly. I went to church and went to a Catholic school. I would go with my grandfather every Saturday. It didn't matter what was happening. If we had a birthday party going on at 4:30, we could be in the middle of eating. And on Saturday, he'd say, "All right, I'm going to mass. Who's going with me?" And I'd raise my hands and I'd go with him. So that's always been a part of my life. But when I was 18, and moved my senior year of high school from Philly to Michigan, I had a lot of resentment in my life, and I walked away from God. I had a lot of questions. I didn't become an atheist or anything like that. I just basically fell apart. We grew apart. We didn't grow apart. He was always there. I migrated away, and I made a lot of mistakes between 18 and 23 that I wish that I could go back and change, but I grew. Those were learning moments, and I grew through those mistakes. And when I was 23 years old, a couple things had happened. One, I had seen The Passion of the Christ, and that movie shook me. I had so many questions. I'm just sitting here saying, why would he endure so much pain? Why would he go through that? I mean, if he was God, why didn't he just stop it all? Why continue to endure that? And I'd never read the Bible. Even though I was raised Catholic, I never read the Bible. So I cracked open the Bible and I found myself pulling an all-nighter at Starbucks. I just kept on reading and reading and reading and went right back into work from that Starbucks at 6 o'clock in the morning the next morning. Didn't have all my questions answered, but was more curious than ever. I had gone to a leadership conference in Greensboro, North Carolina, a couple months after that. I'm at this conference and this worship team comes out and they play 3 songs that I knew. And then this pastor came out and he started talking about letting go of all the pain and resentment and frustration in your life. And he did this altar call and said, if there's anyone who's been carrying that burden with you and you're just ready to let it all go, come on down. Ran from the rafters of that auditorium down to the front. And I gave my life to Christ January in 2004. And I remember just the weight of the world falling off my shoulders. All that bitterness, all that resentment, all that anger just disappeared, just vaporized. I just felt so much lighter. And I came home from that conference. And 3 days later, I got an invitation from my mother to take a family friend of ours to her church on a Wednesday afternoon. And I'm thinking, who goes to church on Wednesday? Well, the church that she had gone to had this midweek service, and I offered to take her to church. I was working at Costco wholesale at the time as a marketing manager, and she called me while I was at work, and I said, sure, when I get off, I'll go pick her up and take her there. I go and take her there, and I was going to drop her off and go to Starbucks and then come back and pick her back up. And as I dropped her off, she said, well, won't you come on in? And I went on in, and this is 3 days after I just gotten saved in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I walk in and I sit down with her, and the worship team comes out. and they played the same 3 songs that I just heard in Greensboro, North Carolina 3 days earlier in the same order. And I look at her and I said, "Do you guys have a church in Greensboro, North Carolina?" And she goes, "No, this is like our only church." And, then the worship pastor came out and he spoke on the same exact verse that I just heard 3 days earlier in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I knew that God had gotten my attention. And I was particularly intrigued with the worship leader who was leading from Keys there. And because I love music. And the next day I'm back at Costco and I get a phone call from the front desk. They said, "Hey, one of our nonprofit accounts has a problem with their membership. Can you come on down?" And I go down to the front desk, and there standing at the front desk is the guy who was leading worship from the piano the night before. And I just walked up to him and I said, "Dude, your band is awesome." And he goes, "My band? What are you talking about?" I said, "I was at your church last night. It was amazing." He goes, "That's not my band. I'm the worship pastor there. They're all volunteers." And we ended up getting a slice of pizza in the Costco food court and talked for an hour. I don't know if we ever solved whatever his problem was, but we became good friends right off the bat. And I started attending that church from that Sunday. And I was there for the next 20 years. I met my bride there. We got married there, dedicated our kids there, raised our kids there. I ended up joining the worship team and ended up leading worship from the same piano that he did when he went to go plant a church in Boston. And that became our church home for the next 20 years.
Did you learn the same 3 songs?
I did eventually. I don't know if we ever played them in the same order on a Sunday. No one's ever asked that question, Bill. But yes, at some point in time, I did end up playing those songs.
It was played just for you, Davin.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, it sounds like you walked into a franchise or something,
It felt like it. Well, being raised Catholic, they do the same hymns and the same verses and everything, no matter where you go. So I just assumed that they had a parish in Greensboro, North Carolina, but that wasn't the case. They were completely an independent, non-denominational church. So God clearly was getting my attention.
Now tell us a little bit about your work journey.
Well, I'd mentioned that I was at Costco at that time. No one raises their hand and just says, "I want to go work in retail." I went to school to be a teacher. I wanted to be a high school teacher.
No one sane does that, Davin.
Sane
People do it, but they
That's right,
clearly
they
don't
do.
know what they're
Right.
doing.
No, ask anyone in their high school or college years what they want to do. None of them say, "I want a long career in retail."
Speaking as someone who's been in retail.
That's right. That's right. You just kind of find yourself there. I went to school to be a teacher. I wanted to be a high school teacher. That's what I wanted to do. And while I was going to school and putting myself through school, I heard Costco was a great company to work for, and I started working for them while I was putting myself through school. And there was an interaction that I had with Jim Sinegal, the founder and CEO of Costco, that changed the entire trajectory of my career and life. He was known for constantly walking around stores and talking to employees. In fact, his office was a lifetime pop-up table and a folding chair on top of the first Costco in Issaquah, Washington. And there was nothing else in that room because he was never there. He was constantly 228 days a year. He was out visiting stores. And he had come into my store and he walked up to me and, khaki pants on, button down shirt, little name badge that said Jim. And he reached his hand out and he said, "Hi, I'm Jim. What's your name?" And I said, "I'm Davin." And he knew my name was Davin. I had a name badge that said Davin, but he wanted to make this human connection. He held my hand and shook it and looked me right in the eye for a long time. And it was such a sincere gesture of his. And he said, "Davin, tell me, what are we doing well at Costco and what could we be doing better?" He was a walking, talking engagement survey before engagement surveys were a thing. And I'm thinking, why are you asking me? Why aren't you asking like the general manager? Why are you asking the marketing manager? And then he asked me this question. He said, "Davin, why do you work at Costco? What are your goals and dreams? And by working here, are we going to help you achieve those?" And that question sent me sideways. I'm thinking,
That's impressive.
why do you care whether or not I'm going to accomplish my goals and dreams by working for your company? And I've shared over the years that there's really 2 types of business leaders out there, right? There's business leaders that use people to build their business, and then there's business leaders that use their business to build people. And I learned that from Jim. Jim was using his business to build people. And I very quickly became an avid student of leadership. I started reading and digesting everything I possibly could on the topic of leadership, from Blanchard to Lencioni and Maxwell and Buckingham and you name them. And I was just absorbing content. And for the next 7 years, I walked around and emulated, Jim's leadership model. And one day I was having a conversation with the vice president of Macy's. I was playing hockey with him every Tuesday and Thursday morning in Michigan. And I was just constantly talking about purpose and leadership and culture. And he's like, we need you to come over here to Macy's and sprinkle some of this purpose, culture, leadership stuff over here. So one of the great things about Costco is the culture was so great that no one ever left. One of the bad things about Costco is the culture was so great that no one ever left. So there was really no upward mobility. So Macy's offered me this opportunity to not just grow, but to make a difference and to take something that I gleaned from Costco and change people's lives. So I made the leap from Costco to Macy's and started to emulate this leadership model over there. I worked with them for 3 years, and then the bottom fell out between 2008, 2010. And they just were more interested in keeping stores open than they were in developing culture and leadership. And a headhunter had contacted me and recruited me to CVS Pharmacies, now CVS Health. They were growing quickly by acquisition. When I joined them, they had 5,000 stores. When I left them, they had 10,000 stores. They were Fortune 28 when I joined them. They were Fortune 5 when I left. But they wanted me to come in. They were really great at process and execution, but they were not great at people, purpose, and culture. And whenever you're growing quickly by acquisition, you got to figure out how to bring everyone into alignment. And that was kind of why I was brought in there. I spent 7 years working with them. And in 2016, at the end of those 7 years, I found myself torn. And the reason I found myself torn is because we were talking about a lot of these purpose leadership concepts at CVS, but we really weren't living them out. We had a really healthy P&L, but internally we were cutting resources. People were constantly being asked to do more with less. And, I had a conversation with the president of the company. She's not there anymore, so I don't mind sharing the story. But I said, we just changed our mission statement to helping people on their path to better health. Who are we helping? The people that come in every day and give us their money, or the people who come in every single day and give us their life, who've given us their time over the last 30 years? And she said, you're right, but we're a Fortune 8 company and we need to do what we need to do to reward our shareholders. That sentence shook me because it was so different than where I was at with Jim, 10 years prior. Here was a company that was now using people to build their business rather than using their business to build their people. And they've changed some things around today, and I'm sure they're a great company now. But just in this season of time, I was feeling a nudge like something's not right. And a friend of mine had given me a book by Bob Buford called Halftime. And he warned me, he said, Davin, knowing you, if you read this book, you might quit your job. So because he said that, I didn't read the book. The book sat on my desk for 6 months. But at the end of this conversation, coming back from Rhode Island, I had that book in my briefcase and I opened it up and I read it. And I had this conversation with God on the plane. I said, God, you've given me almost 20 years of experience in marketing and human resources and operations. What do you want me to do with this? And I had met the founders of CVS, and CVS had stood for Consumer Value Stores. And when the two guys who started CVS started it, they didn't want to be the Woolworth five and dime entering all of these markets. They wanted to be the little shop at the corner that when you came in and you bought something, they made your life better, that they valued you above the profit, above the product, and that when you left, your life was impacted because you shopped in their store. That's where CVS came from. But so few people knew that story. They didn't know what CVS stood for. And he said, I want you to go help remember people. I want you to go back and help companies remember their purpose. I want you to go back and help leaders like the founders of CVS, like Jim Sinegal at Costco, to remember why they started their business and to use business to build people and not people to build business. And so I got off that plane. I put in my notice at CVS. I started a consulting company called Purpose Point, and I went to go work with small to mid-sized business owners to remember their founding purpose for why they went into business and to help them steward their business, to use it as a vehicle to build people and not to use people to build business. I've been doing that for the last 8 years. I wrote a couple books, Finding Purpose at Work in 2020, which became a bestseller. And then most recently, Thieves of Purpose, which talk about the things that, there it is, the 12 mindsets that rob us of stepping into our purpose and potential on a daily basis. I met some amazing friends along the way who were writing and speaking about purpose the way that I was. And in 2019, we started an event called the Purpose Summit, where we brought together purpose-driven leaders like Jim Sinegal and people like Jason Lipper and Gary Ridge from WD-40 and Charlie Maloof from Broad River Retail and Ashley Home Stores and business leaders that we knew that were modeling this well. And We've been stewarding that summit for the last 6 years. Next year will be the 7th year that we do the Purpose Summit. And now I have the opportunity recently to work with a publishing company on helping other people get published. So I'm in the process of writing a 3rd book, stewarding others along their writing journey, working with this publishing company, and then walking alongside organizations, continuing to keep their purpose and their people in front of their journey. So that's been a little bit about my journey.
That's quite the journey. So I'm curious. I'm going to ask you a real quick question about your books. If you would, if you're thinking about your books, you're on the 3rd one, but let's pretend you've already written it for a second, and you'd say, hey, if there was one thing that I would like people to remember coming out of these books, the aggregation of all that information and knowledge and inspiration, one thing would you really hope they would remember most?
That's such a timely question because I have a list of like 20 different titles of books that I'm thinking about writing, and I'm trying to think like what should be the next one? Like what's the natural order? You know, the thing is none of us are promised tomorrow. So there's a piece of me that has like this one specific title that I want to wait to be like the very last book that I write. But then there's a piece of me that's like, well, if the Lord calls me home tomorrow, I'll never write that book. So maybe that should be the next one. But it's the answer to your question. And if I wanted anyone to remember anything, it would be 2 words. And those 2 words would be so that. I have been obsessed with the word so that. And the reason why is I think so that is the bridge to so many things that we've got questions to. Romans 8:28 is my life verse. I've got many verses that I could say are my life verse, but the one that I quote most is Romans 8:28. And for those who haven't read Romans 8:28, it says that we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, comma, who are called according to his purpose. And many times we put a period where that comma is. All things work together for the good of those who love God, period, comma, who are called according to his purpose. So when we recognize that there is a purpose that God has for us, that we are here for a very specific reason, that we are here so that fill in the blank. When we start looking at everything in our life through the lens of so that, this is happening so that fill in the blank. I have a friend of mine, he was a discipleship pastor at our former church. His name's Mickey, and he once said, stop asking God why and start asking God what. When bad things happen, when things aren't going the way that you want, and you're like, why, God, is this happening? Why is this not happening? When you replace why with what God is it that you're doing? What God would you have me do? What God am I supposed to learn through this? What is this being used for? This is happening so that fill in the blank. I can now look back over my life at so many things that I asked why in the moment, so many things where I was frustrated or impatient and I didn't understand why things were happening the way that they were happening. And I can now talk about stories where I've used those moments to encourage others or to comfort others, right? To comfort people with the same measure of comfort that we've been given. I can look back at all of the stuff that I went through and say, God used that so that fill in the this person's life was impacted, or this happened, or that happened. When we start looking at the masterpiece that God is weaving through our lives, and we see each minute, each moment, good or bad, as something that God uses, that this happens so that that can happen, it changes our entire perspective on life. So the next book that I'm considering writing is called So That. And there'll be more to that, but that's where I'm at.
Can't wait to read it. And so certainly one of the things I think about often is what is my purpose? And I definitely want to serve it for my generation because that day's coming to a close. And welcome that day.
So good. So good. You know, that's one of the other things. One of my favorite lyrics ever written of any song is from the song Goodness of God. And it's the crescendo of the chorus where it says, all my life you've been faithful. All my life you've been so, so good. And so people make fun of me because I say so, so good all the time. I hashtag so, so good on social media. But the reason why is because I say it when I see God's work at hand, when I see his purpose alive in our lives. And a lot of times when you unpack that sense, all my life you've been faithful. All my life you've been so, so good. If I go back and look at my life, there's a lot of mess there. But yet he was faithful through all of it. there was a purpose in all of it.
Amen.
And I hope that I served his purpose in all of that. And when you look at life through that lens and you could see that there's such goodness, that it is so, so good, even though you can't see it in the moment, then it gives us glimpses into how God is using us now and how he might use us in whatever the next thing that comes our way, right? So
Yeah.
I appreciate that, your perspective on making sure that how did you say it? You've been through much. Say it again. You said it. You've been through much. What was the phrase that you used?
Well, I mean, I've got a lot of days behind me.
Yes. You got a lot of days behind you, but each one of those days was used for a very specific purpose, and each one of
It's good
them was
work.
so good.
Absolutely.
Davin, you spent, as you were telling us your story, you spent a lot of your career in large organizations, and then in this that were existing long before you got there. And then in this most recent chapter, you've been able to build an organization. And I'm curious what that process was like, and how you might have seen the Lord at work in particular circumstances in that, especially when it was so out of your what you had been doing. I mean, it was similar, but there are a lot of new aspects of that in that new chapter.
Yeah, and I never wanted to build an organization. I wanted to steward an idea, which then became a movement, which then became an organization, which now has kind of become several organizations that work intertwinedly with each other. But for me, it was never about growing a business. It was never about growing an organization. So it's not like I one day had this like blueprint, like, okay, I've led businesses, I've led organizations, now I'm going to start my own. That was never, ever a part of the picture. God built all of it. I just wanted to continue to be a steward of the message, the mission, and the movement that I suddenly found myself leading. And I use God before leading because I hesitate to say that word, because it's really him leading it. And I just want to continue to make sure that I'm in alignment with that. And that might sound so cliche, like everyone's, yes, we know, okay, it's not me, God, deflect the glory. Yes, we all do that. But the reality is it's becoming more and more uncommon. There are so many people. I talk about this actually in chapter 2 of the book on competition. There's so many people that are more focused on building their kingdom than building the kingdom. We see this in church all the time. So many churches plant a church and they're not trying to start an organization or start a business. They're supposed to be stewarding the Great Commission. But then often mission drift happens and it becomes about building the organization, and it becomes about maintaining the organization. And we miss the focus of what the founding purpose of what we were building was. It doesn't matter whether you're a business, a nonprofit, or a church, they all go through this journey. Every organization starts with a purpose, not with a business idea. They see a need in the world and they either develop a product, a service, a solution, or something that is meant to meet that need in the world. And then they invite people to be a part of that. And then they start putting processes in place, and that's where it becomes an organization. Then they start measuring performance. Then they start making a profit. And then all too often it becomes about performance, profit, and process. And they forget the founding purpose that they existed for and that they invited people to be a part of something. So because I've spoken so much on that topic, when we launched this, for me, I was acutely aware to continue to make sure that we kept the purpose for why we were doing this in front, and that we continued to invite people a part of that, even if that meant the death of the organization that was put in place to support it, which is actually what happened. So I had started a consulting company called Purpose Point, and the only reason that I had started that was because legally I needed an LLC to do business. And then I invited people to be a part of this purpose and this mission. Well, at some point we grew into a multi-million-dollar organization with employees and everything else. And I started to see mission drift happening. And I started to see us pulling away from our purpose. And in 2023, I had to sit down with our entire team, our partners, with W-2 employees, many who made a great wage, and said, I think that we need to undo this. When I look back at when we were most fruitful, it was when there really wasn't an organization. It was when we were all 1099 contractors with a shared mission, on a shared mission, a part of a shared movement, operating under this legal entity called Purpose Point LLC. And I think we need to go back to that. I think the organization that we built needs to die so that we can save the founding purpose that we were called to. And that was really, really hard. So in 2023, we actually took apart the organization to save the founding purpose and to be a better steward of what we were being given. And until we did that, we couldn't get back to the founding thing that we were called to do. And I'm so glad that we did that. It wasn't easy. It was extremely hard. 2024 was the hardest year of my life that I had to walk through. There's a lot we can unpack there, but I can now look back halfway through 2025 and say that that was one of the most important critical decisions that we could have made. Or quite frankly, there might not be a purpose summit. Quite frankly, the movement would have died. The impact that continues to live on might not be living on, because I don't think God would have honored what we were building. And so it had to die so that we could save the founding purpose that we were initially called to.
Davin, I know that there are a lot of people that would like to hear more about the Purpose Summit, and I'd like to hear you talk about the Purpose Summit a little more. I've attended it myself. Wonderful opportunity for business leaders to gather and really seek out their purpose and rub elbows with people who are really spending lots and lots of time not only thinking and talking about purpose, but actually living that out and executing. But I also just want to hear you, maybe from your own personal experience, tell us a little bit how you've seen God at work.
You know, both of those questions are actually kind of intertangled. They're not questions. They were talking about what the Purpose Summit is and then God at work. So I'm going to answer the second question and then I'll come back to the Purpose Summit.
Okay.
I have this vision. I don't know how we're going to do it. We caught a glimpse of it last year to kick off the beginning of the Purpose Summit, Rick, which you had seen. But this vision that I have, there are now thousands of people who have attended the Purpose Summit over the last 6 years.
Right.
And
Right.
I constantly see stories of how their lives have either gone in different directions or something has happened as a result of something God did through their experience at the summit. And make no mistake, this is not meant to be an endorsement or a commercial for the summit. This is meant to
It's okay.
what I'm trying to say here is,
We've already plugged your books, Davin, so plugging the summit is
but I want to make sure
not
people
out of the
hear
range.
this, right? I have a good friend, his name Kent Chevalier. He's the chaplain for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's got this great phrase, "deflect the glory." And I want to make sure that people understand that when I say this, they understand that's what I'm doing here. Is that there are so many people whose lives are in a different place, or now they weren't. They've written a book that they wouldn't have written. They started a company they wouldn't have started. They've changed the way they were leading a company and shifted from using people to build business to using business to build people. They've made other relationships and collaborations have formed and friendships have forged. I've often said that the greatest measure of impact of Summit, its greatest value, isn't anything that's said from stage. It's the friendships that are formed, the relationships that are forged, and the collaborations that are born coming out of that. And I've always wanted to some way visualize that because I see all these stories. And so one day I said, we're going to have, I don't know how to do this. Maybe we put a whole bunch of tacks in a jar and we've got this massive wall and a lot of string. And when people come into the summit, they grab a tack, they put it on a wall, they put their name on it. And then at some point through the summit, all these tacks are on the wall and you go and you take string and you tie string from your tack to every other tack that God has connected you in some way, shape, or form where they've impacted your life or you've impacted their life. And we would see this massive, crazy mess of knots on a wall. And it would be a beautiful thing to see. And the reason I say that is there's a old little story about this grandma who's in her rocking chair and she's knitting and her granddaughter's sitting on the floor and she sees the backside of what she's knitting and she says, "Grandma, what are you doing?" She says, "A whole bunch of messy knots." And the grandmother says, "Well, that's because you're looking at it from where you're sitting." And then she turns around, she goes, "But from where I'm sitting, it's a masterpiece." And she flips it around. And so for me, that's much of what I've seen happen through the summit. I see all these knots, but then from a bigger perspective, I see this masterpiece that God has woven through it by looking at the relationships that have been formed, the friendships that have been forged, collaborations that have been born on now a global scale. So there's a lot that God has done. I can give you story after story after story after story. But coming back.
Well, give us one.
Give
us
you
one.
Give you one. Okay, I'll give you one. This is probably my favorite. My favorite Purpose Summit story, and he doesn't mind me sharing the story, is of a guy named Simon. Simon came to the Purpose Summit in 2023. He came as a banking executive from Huntington Bank, and he was an atheist. And when he came to the summit because he was there to meet CEOs. Now, I didn't know he was an atheist until much later. but we don't market the summit as a Christian event or a faith-based event. There are certainly faith-based themes built into it. When we talk about purpose, we talk about it from multiple perspectives. We talk about business purpose. We talk about individual purpose. We talk about spiritual purpose. We talk about nonprofit purpose. It's a convergence of all things purpose. So naturally, God's going to be a part of the conversation, but it's not exclusively a Christian event, which is why he came. So he comes to the summit because he knows that there's going to be other CEOs that are there and he's there to network. And so he comes to the summit, he leaves. And 9 months after the summit, I get a letter in the mail. And the letter is from Simon. And Simon says, Davin, you don't know me, but I owe you and everyone at the Purpose Summit my life. He said, when I came to the summit, I came as an atheist. I came to meet CEOs, to do business, and hopefully land a couple banking deals. But if I'm being honest with myself, I also came as a depressed, suicidal alcoholic who had left his marriage, walked out on his adult special needs son, and I was just looking for a reason to keep on living. And I had plans when I left the summit to take my life. And I came to the summit and I found my life. I found my purpose. And he was in the second day of the summit. He had went back to the back of the room. We had a table from corporate chaplains there, and he had given his life to Christ at the corporate chaplains table. And he left the summit. He quit his job. He re-engaged in his marriage. He became a full-time caregiver to his adult special needs son. And then he started an insurance company for people who could not get insurance, for the underserved, for the marginalized, who had special needs that were uninsurable because of pre-existing conditions. And now he is living a thriving life of purpose and is a shining beacon of hope to so many people. And so I sit here and look at this and it's like, wow, God used this event to take someone who was literally at the end of his rope, at the end of his life, and in such a challenging situation, and not just save his life, but now to call him into a whole new life that is now impacting so many other people. And I look at the ripple effect that now Simon is having on the lives of other people and think, what would have happened if he didn't come? What would have happened had he not come? And there's just so many stories like that.
Davin, you've been so generous with your time today, and I know you've got a hard stop coming up, and we will certainly want to respect that. If somebody wanted to learn about the summit and the gathering, where would they go to find that?
Well, first of all, you guys have been gracious hosts. Thank you so much for having me on. And for allowing me to share so openly and vulnerably. The Purpose Summit, you can go to thepurposesummit.com is the URL, thepurposesummit.com. You could view all of the talks from previous years there. You can find information about the summit next year. It'll be in fall of 2026. We don't have the exact dates yet. Stay tuned. They're getting released in the coming weeks. But fall of 2026 will be the next summit.
Well, we know about Thieves of Purpose. Tell us about the title of your second book.
The first book was Finding Purpose.
Sorry.
That's okay. The first book was Finding Purpose at Work. It's a short book, compilation of stories. I showed the Jim Sinegal story in there.
Very interesting.
For those of you who know Ken Blanchard, dear friend and mentor of mine, he wrote the foreword to that book. Ken is now almost 86 years old, but that, he without him, that book probably wouldn't be in existence. I'm grateful for his friendship and that book. And then the second book is Thieves of Purpose, 12 Mindsets Robbing You of your purpose and your potential. Stay tuned. Third book, tentatively, might be So That. But I've got some other titles in the works.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much.